Hello and welcome from me, Mike Scott in the UK, and Kathryn Temple, who is in Adelaide, Australia, and Joe Simmons, who's in Georgetown in Washington. The magic of Zooms. It's terrific. Thank you for joining us to this, the second event in our new series, which is following on from the Literary Imagination series and our earlier series called Christian Shakespeare ? All three are part of Georgetown University's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute, Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Kathryn Temple in Australia, who's one of our joint conveners, who's going to introduce our speaker today. And it's very exciting to have a speaker today who's going to talk about a Chilean poet. It's very exciting for us. We're breaking new ground as far as these Zooms are concerned. Your participation, as ever, is important to us. So please type in any questions you have by using your Q&A key at the bottom of your screen. You can do this from the moment we start, and we will endeavour to answer your questions either today or through email if time runs out on us. Please ensure that you use the Q&A button and not the chat button. And so I'll pass over to Kathryn.
Hi, and good morning. It's the middle of the night for me here in Australia, but it's good morning for a lot of the folks here. I think it's good afternoon for Mike. I'm really excited by our speaker today, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce her as soon as I can get the introduction up on my screen. Here we go. So I'm introducing Ana Deeny Morales, who grew up between Washington, D.C. and her mother's island, Puerto Rico. She works in poetry and music as a librettist, translator, and literary critic. Recent works in opera include Zavala Zavala, an opera in V cuts, which debuted at, is that 5 cuts, Anna? Which debuted at the Kennedy Center in 2022, and La Paloma at the Wall, which debuted in 2019 at Gala Hispanic Theater. The National Endowment for the Arts Fellow for her translation of the volume Tala from 1938 by Latin America's first Nobel laureate in literature, Gabriela Mistral. Deeny Morales has also translated, edited, and written about the works of the contemporary Chilean poet Raul Zurita and the Argentine poets Alejandra Pizarnik and Mercedes Rofe, among others. Forthcoming works include her edited, translated selection of ego poems by the Chilean anti-poet Nicanor Parra and Identity of Certain Fruits by Uruguayan poet Amanda Berenguera. In 2023, she will serve as a judge for the American Academy of Poets Translation Award. Deeny Morales received her DPhil in Hispanic Languages and Literatures from the University of California at Berkeley. She holds an MA in Comparative Literature from Dartmouth College and a BA in English Literature with a minor in Piano Performance from Shepherd University. She has lectured at Dartmouth and Harvard and is currently an adjunct professor in the Center for Latin American Studies at Georgetown University. And her book, Other Solitudes, Essays on Consciousness and Poetry, which sounds fascinating, is forthcoming in 2023. So with that, I introduce my colleague, Ana Deeny Morales, and I will turn it over to you, Ana.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. To you, Kathryn, who are, as you said, in Australia. Thank you for introducing me and for inviting me to participate in this series of the Future of the Humanities Project, which is dedicated this year to art, literature, and the environment. And thanks as well to Professor Mike Scott at Oxford University and to Mary Gordon of Global Events, who's helping me today, as well as to Father Joseph Simmons, who's here at Georgetown. Thank you to all those who have accompanied us. And last but not least, thanks to the National Endowment for the Arts for supporting my study and translation of Gabriela Mistral, about whom I'll speak today. So I'll begin with a brief biography of Mistral, for those of you who are not familiar with her and her work. In 1945, Gabriela Mistral became the first Latin American writer and the 5th woman to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. Née Lucila Godoy Alcayaga, Mistral was born in 1889 to a small family in the Elqui Valley of northern Chile, an isolated but breathtaking region at once bound and liberated by the circular and sublime Andes Mountains. Mary, could you go ahead and put up and share the PowerPoint? Thank you so much. Mistral's father would soon abandon the family, leaving her, along with an older sister and mother, exposed to precarious economic and social circumstances. That's great there, Mary. Thank you so much. Although Mistral was largely self-taught, she would become an intellectual and poet of international repute. Mistral began her career in primary and secondary education in Chile and wrote hundreds of essays on topics such as education, women, children, poverty, the environment, literature, culture, and politics. A Pan-Americanist who promoted regional solidarity and cooperation, Mistral joined Mexico's Minister of Education, José Vasconcelos, to develop a public rural system after that country's revolution. She also worked for the United Nations in distinct official capacities, served Chile as a consul in various countries, and collaborated with the Institute for Intellectual Cooperation of the League of Nations. Mistral volumes of poetry include Desolación, Desolation from 1922, Ternura, which means tenderness, from 1924, Tala, about which we'll speak today, from 1938, and Lagar from 1954. Posthumous works include Poemas de Chile, Poems of Chile, which was published in 1967, and Lagar II, published in 1991. Mistral also adopted a boy who some believed to be her nephew and others her biological son. His name was Juan Miguel Godoy, or as she affectionately called him, Yin Yin, and he took his own life in 1943 at the age of 18, only a few years before Mistral received the Nobel Prize. When she passed away in 1957, over 40,000 unedited manuscripts remained in her archive that was maintained by Doris Dana, her partner, with whom she lived in New York. Mary, could you change the slide, please? Thank you so much. So this is a picture of the Elqui Valley. And could you go to the next slide? Great, thank you so much, Mary, perfect. In reasons for this book, which begins the final section of Tala, Gabriela Mistral dedicates the volume of poetry and any proceeds to, quote, the innocent blood of Spain. Although Tala was published in Argentina in 1938, Mistral had spent the previous 10 years writing the book while she served as a consul for Chile on the Iberian Peninsula. By innocent blood, Mistral was referring to the thousands of children exiled during and after the Spanish Civil War, which lasted from 1936 to 1939. She explains, "Now I give Tala because I have nothing else to give the Spanish children dispersed to the four winds. It is my greatest astonishment, I could also say my most acute shame, to see my Spanish America with arms crossed before the tragedy of the Basque children. It is the first time in my life that I do not comprehend my race and that its moral attitude leaves me in a stupor. It is impossible at this moment to trace from America the roots and encampments of those children crumbled through European soil." Mary, could you change the slide, please? Thank you. Between 1936 and 1940, Mexico did receive around 25,000 Basque children, and Venezuela received several hundred. Even though other Latin American countries, among them Argentina and Chile, opened their borders to the children after the war, no effort was made to actually transport them. In Europe, their burden was shared by France, England, and you can see here a photo from 1937 when almost 4,000 were taken to England. Belgium, Switzerland, Denmark, and Holland, along with the Soviet Union. The United States denied them entry. While this passage speaks to a specific historical moment, here Mistral solidifies her thinking and indeed despair regarding the relationship between children and humanity, language and nutriment, sound and orphanhood, massive geographic displacement, along with the possibilities of poetic form, exile, and belonging. Here, the state of exile, the forced crossing of international borders, ushers forth the tension between two competing categories, that of citizen and that of human. And it is the category of citizen that wins out over the category of human, thus producing the atrocity of refusal. The Declaration of the Rights of the Child, established in 1924, slide please, by the League of Nations, and of which Mistral was surely aware, defined the state of childhood as a special category to be defended and nurtured. But Mistral went beyond these concepts of the child as a special category within the human. Instead, she believed that what defines us in our humanity is precisely our treatment of children, whether they be biologically or not biologically, as in the case of the Basque children, our own. In addition to the fact that these children were orphaned, Mistral laments that they were not received by people who spoke their language, that is, people who sounded as they did. Thus, her disdain regarding how Latin Americans in particular did not receive these children. Mistral conceived of language and indeed poetic form as a mother country, as that which receives us in our exile, orphanhood, solitude, foreignness, or dispersion. However, instead of dispersed, Mistral uses the word desmigada, or crumbled, as in a crumbled loaf of bread. Indeed, Mistral figures bread throughout her oeuvre, but here the image of a child as bread, as well as broken down, destroyed in its dispersal, is central to Tala and to a soundscape that is quotidian, humble, almost inaudible, held in our hands, subtle, intimate, most closely related to silence. This is a soundscape that forces listeners to pay close attention, lest you not hear the great need, as simple and basic as bread, embedded in it. Although in Reasons for this book, the title of this last section of Tala, Mistral does not speak to the specific environmental conditions that presence or absent that bread. Such conditions are alluded to throughout Tala, and it is precisely the tension between that presence and absence that Mistral wishes to sound. So how does Mistral sound that relationship between the intimacy of feeding one's child and the land's ability or inability to relieve that child's hunger? What rhythmic, temporal, or linguistic structures would such a relationship take in poetic form, and why? The Fell and the Fugue. While Mistral begins her second book, Ternura, or tenderness, with the rhythmic back and forth of rocking or cradling. So the first poem of the book called Tenderness is called Me Siento. The second section of Ternura transitions into rondas, a game in which children create a circle to round something. So she goes from the back and forth movement of rocking to a round movement. Rondas, a game in which children create a circle to go around something, be it an object or in the poetic case, an idea. But the ronda, also round in English musical form, is often a popular polyphonic vocal composition in which 3 or 4 voices each follow each other in a perpetual canon at the unison or octave. Tala, the book about which we're speaking today, begins with the poem La Fuga, or the Fugue. The fugal form is a more intensified round or canon. So while in Ternura she begins with the round, this is very intensified in the book Tala by beginning with the fugal form. The fugue is a contrapuntal composition in which short melody or phrase or the subject is introduced by one part and successively taken up by others and developed by interweaving parts. I believe that the fugal form manages a tension between intimate detail, the possibility of human tenderness and unmanageable geographic breadth, forces like God, but also history and death that are desperately out of one's hands. When you play, for example, Johann Sebastian Bach's early 18th century fugues in the Well-Tempered Clavier, Bach is exploring ranges of particular keys, but through very close proximity, while applying strict rules of counterpoint. So there's this idea of the possibility of a range of intimacies at the same time that works in tension with the strict rules of counterpoint. On the one hand, time as an insistent punctual hammer that reflects an idea of God as a chronometer in Bach, as ultimate force over the mechanisms of the piece. On the other hand, Bach's explorations of sound actually oppose the centripetal force to produce an idea of the human body and human agency, not from distance, however, but in intimacy, in tenderness, because of the detailed range demanded of the hands as they stay small and close to the keys. In the first stanza of Mistral's fugue, the poetic voice wanders through landscapes that are cardenosos, which could mean thistled, but also violet, black and blue, and even bruised. I've highlighted the word cardenosos for you there, and we'll read it in a second. The circularity of the fugal form in its two voices in tension belong to the poetic voice, the first person singular, and the mother, the you, who is painfully and perpetually just out of reach. So I'll read just these two stanzas in Spanish and in English. Madre mía, en el sueño ando por paisajes cardenosos, un monte negro que se contornea siempre para alcanzar el otro monte y en el que sigue estás tú vagamente, pero siempre hay otro monte redondo que circundar para pagar el paso al monte de tu gozo y de mi gozo. Again, this is the first stanza of the fugue. My mother, in the dream I wander through these violet lands, a black mountain that turns and bends, always to reach one toward the other. You only just on the one that follows, but there is always another mountain to round, the price to pay the toll to the mountain of your joy and of my own. In the Spanish, Mistral uses decasyllables and endecasyllables, 10 and 11 syllable lines, a strict counterpoint, while in my English translation, I've generally used tetrameters. In my rendition, I've also drawn on the O's and R's to synesthetically maintain a sullen, dark mood. Those are sounds that, for me, in my mind, are somber and darker. I translated cardenosos as violet to signify the color as well as insinuate the word violence. Tautological words like turns and bends, or the repetition of one, other, toward, and another, your and my own, convey the idea of staying close in sound, image, and concept. In the Spanish, Mistral repeats terms like otro monte, or words with similar meanings, and of course, assonance and alliteration, such as cardenoso, contornea, and circundar. Thus, on the one hand, you must stay close in order to actually follow that line, which in this case has a dizzying effect. On the other hand, you are staying close vis-a-vis a force you ultimately cannot control because it is out of your reach, like the mother who the first person singular follows. While this poem reflects an autobiographical specificity, because indeed Mistral's mother had recently passed, the maternal figure is then multiplied, dismembered, and dispersed into the landscape. Here below is the fourth stanza. Could you change the slide, Mary? Thank you so much. Y otras veces ni estás cerro adelante, ni vas conmigo, ni vas en mi soplo. Te has disuelto con niebla en las montañas, te has cedido al paisaje cardenoso y me das unas voces de sarcasmo. Desde 3 puntos y en dolor me rompo, porque mi cuerpo es uno, el que me diste, y tú eres un agua de 100 ojos y eres un paisaje de 1000 brazos. Nunca más lo que son los amorosos, un pecho vivo sobre un pecho vivo, nudo de bronce ablandado en sollozo. Other times you're neither in the hill ahead, nor with me, nor in my breath. You have dissolved with the mountain's mist. You have given in to the violet land. And you, your voice from 3 points doles derision, and my body gives way because it is the one that you gave. And you are water of 100 eyes and are land of 1,000 arms, nevermore what loved ones are, a living chest on a living chest, a bronze knot that is eased in sob. Aaron Finser has observed that Mistral was an early ecofeminist who believed that Pan-Americanism and conservationism were mutual ideologies. Anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, Mistral, quote, urged women to take up the fight for both conserving Latin America's natural resources and for keeping Latin America in the land in the hands of Latin Americans. For Mistral, the selling of land by families who depended on subsistence farming to larger, particularly foreign corporations constituted a form of amputation. She believed that women had a responsibility to conserve a land that was inherently connected to her families, that is, her children's well-being. These ideas, explains Finser, were radical, not only in their autonomous politics, but in their implicit linkage of feminism and environmentalism to promote common goals of autonomy and well-being for the earth and her inhabitants. In Conversando sobre la Tierra, which is the next slide, Mistral writes, when the father, the husband, or the brother mortgage or sell that cultivated piece of land, the woman is the only one who weeps, who feels in that soil a characteristic of flesh and mourns. She used the word se duele. It's like a reflexive verb of mourning herself. And mourns the loss like an amputation. When the primitive pueblos assigned to the man fire and air as his elements and identified the woman as earth or soil, the word is tierra in Spanish, as her lot, they were completely right, and they got it even more right, giving the work of cultivation feminine names like Ceres or Pomona or goddess of the maize. Here Mistral refers to legal positions and limitations that women indeed continue to suffer because of gender, laws of inheritance, and a lack of access to juridical and economic resources. According to the Organización de Naciones Unidas por la Alimentación y la Agricultura, in Latin America, rural women account for more than half of food production, play an important role in the conservation of biodiversity, and ensure food sovereignty and food security with the production of wholesome foods. However, they live under conditions of social, political, and economic inequality, receiving only 30% of land titles, 10% of credit, and 5% of technical assistance. I would also like to point out that although the binary Mistral establishes here and identifies with, quote, primitive peoples from the Americas, as well as the Greeks when she refers to Ceres, she is actually establishing an intercultural dialogue rather than a sense of nostalgia. As Jorge Marcone points out with regard to contemporary popular environmentalisms in Latin America, despite their commitment to indigenous values and ontologies, intercultural exchanges do not propose them as an alternative to Western or modern metaphysics, but as the starting point for a collective experimental metaphysics. Such values and ontologies are not viewed, therefore, as nostalgic origins, but should be engaged as, quote, horizontal, collective, and innovative, not for debating the validity of different perspectives, but for moving from a disagreement to an agreement between worlds. So I just want to highlight, in case you missed it, that Mistral has this amputated body. There's multiple amputated bodies that are maternal within this landscape. And that's also how she describes the selling off of land. But I would like to move now to the almost silence that I mentioned previously, related to bread, that I spoke to in my opening paragraphs. We have spoken of the fugue, but not the felling. Tala, the title of this book, means fells, as in the felling of trees, and usually refers to that act done in order to establish large-scale agricultural production, the development of cities or modern infrastructure. I believe that, however, Tala for Mistral also means the felling of sound, so that we may hear what we do not want to hear. In the section called materials or materiales, Mistral moves from pan or bread to water, salt, and finally air, before expanding to the geographic breadth in section America. Pan in Tala, or bread in Tala, alludes to the poem La Casa, or the house or home, again of this previous book called Tenderness, a poem in which bread on the table for one child makes present the absence of bread or hunger of another child. That's the previous poem called La Casa, or the home. In the poem here called Bread from Tala, the poetic voice observes, smells, touches, turns a loaf of bread that is also a child. Here is the translation by Ursula Le Guin. I will read most of the stanzas, but not all of them, in Ursula Le Guin's translation. They left a loaf of bread on the table, white inside, brown crust, its top broken into a scatter of big, snowy crumbs. It seems new, a thing I've never seen, yet it's all I've ever eaten, but half asleep, playing with its crumbs, touch and smell I'd forgotten. It smells like my mother suckling me. It smells like my three valleys, Aconcagua, Pátzcuaro, Elqui. It smells like I feel when I'm singing. There are no other smells in the farmhouse. Could you change the slide, please? Thank you. There are no other smells in the farmhouse, and that's how it could call me. Nobody else around the house, only this loaf broken open on a plate that knows me with its body as I know it with mine. Everywhere in the world, it's been eaten. This same bread, its 100 brothers, bread of Coquimbo, bread of Oaxaca, bread of Santa Ana and Santiago. When I was little, I knew it in the shape of a sun, a fish, a ring, and my hand knew its inner warmth, like a plumy pigeon. Then I forgot it till today, when we two meet, I with my body of an aged Sarah, it with the body of a 5-year-old. And here I'm going to skip a few stanzas to reach the last two. My hand is full of it, and I'm looking at it in my hand. I heave a sigh of regret for the forgetfulness of years. My face grows old or young again with this discovery. Since the house is empty, we too rejoined can be together at this table without meat or fruit, the two of us in this human silence, until once more we're one and our day has ended. Here again, the bread is the child. Bread is a sentient earth being who is held, who returns the speaker to maternal beings and lands, but also to community with others. I want to refrain from a concept of personification to emphasize Mistral's sense of interconnectedness. Bread as child, but also as maize, corn, as those who cultivated that bread, as the mother who does not have to weep or feel amputated because her land was not sold. This is the expansiveness that Mistral's poetics permit. In addition, I would like to draw your attention to the concept of it knowing with its body as I know it with mine. Here, as she does with the child analogically in the mutual recognition of one another, Mistral offers an intersubjectivity grounded in tenderness. That is, when one, in this case the first person singular that speaks and looks, generally allows the other, considered the object or the child watched and spoken to establish the terms of engagement. So I'll say that again. One allows the other to establish the terms of engagement. That's what Mistral understood as tenderness. Because of time, I would like to end on absence, because that is truly the essence of Tala, the result of the felling. Here is country of absence in my translation. Could you switch the slide, please, Mary? Thank you so much. Country of absence, strange country, lighter than angel and subtle sign, color of lifeless algae, color of peregrine, with age of forever, ageless, pleased. No pomegranate sprout or jasmine raised, nor does it have indigo skies or seas. Its name, I never heard it said, and in nameless country I will end. No bridge or boat brought me here. No one ever told me of country or isle. I did not search for it, nor could ever find. It looks like a fable that I learn, dream to be taken and dream to unleash, and it is my homeland I live and end to be. It was born in me of things that are not country, of so many homelands I had and lost, of the children who I saw die, of what was mine and left of me. I lost the cordilleras where I used to sleep, lost orchards of gold so sweet to be, lost the islands of cane and indigo, and their shadows I saw them besieged, and together and lovers become country. Manes of clouds with no neck or spine, breaths asleep I followed behind, and in wandering years country become, and in nameless country I am undone. Remember that the first poem of Tala that we read, the Fugue, makes use of 10 and 11 syllable lines. Here the lines are truncated to 6 and 7 syllables in Spanish and 2 feet in my English version. Here also, the voices of the fugue have been separated as in a centrifuge, distilled so that the one voice accentuates dispersal, loss, and solitude. Mistral's country of absence is a category outside of citizenship. This is where poetry for Mistral dwells. Here, the fugal form finds its vanishing point, its limit in the final stanza, the impossibility of resolution, that is, of resolving the difference between what can be held in one's hand, what can be known, and the forces of distance, exile, the unyielding of time and history that are relentless in their control. A country of absence constitutes the intimacy of loss as it is sounded, of the children who I saw die, of what was mine and left of me. Because this series is committed to a concern for the future of the humanities, I would like to close here by mentioning the recent Gallup poll that I found quite striking. The world broke a lot of records in 2021, writes Gallup CEO John Clifton. Corporate profits, venture capital funding, CO2 emissions, and the temperature of the oceans all reached record highs last year. But there is another record the world broke that hasn't yet made headlines, and it has to do with how everyone feels. Many things make people unhappy, but there are 5 significant contributors to the rise of global unhappiness: poverty, bad communities, hunger, loneliness, and the scarcity of good work. 2 billion people live on insufficient income, and another 2 billion are so unhappy with where they live, they wouldn't recommend it to anyone they know. So I ask, what is the task of the humanities? What is its future? I will end by referring to the contemporary Chilean poet Raúl Zurita and the art action group CADA, who wrote in the 1980s that the work of art is the work in happiness. The work of art is work to improve the lives of others through the distribution of milk and bread to women and children, through the protection of and access to natural resources like water that in Chile was privatized during the dictatorship, and through increasing women and indigenous peoples' access to land for subsistence farming through legal and economic measures. These are the sounds and works of art, sounds and works in reducing hunger, the art, literature, sounds, and works in happiness. So lastly, because Kathryn, you asked me to read a few poems, and I see that here it's around 11:30. I'll just read one last poem. Is that okay, Kathryn? So this is, do you know what, Mary? You can turn off the screen share now. I'll just read it so that you can hear it in my English translation. This is a poem called Dormida, or Sleep, and it was first published in Ternura, in that book Tenderness, but then Mistral published it again in this collection called Tala. I cradle my flesh, I cradle my child, I mill the whole world with wrists alive. The world in arms of woman milled to me becomes a faded cloud. Heft of the world through roof, through glass, through roof, comes into my room, covers them both. They are all of the hills and all of the rivers, all of creation and all born ever. I cradle, and I see lost, the body given me with senses full. Now I don't see the crib, the sun, and I have the world as faded, gone. I cry out to who gave me the world and the child, and then I wake up from my very own cry. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, and thank you for that wonderful paper. That was just, it's fascinating material, and about a poet that I had, no awareness of until I started talking with you about it. So I appreciate it greatly, and I'm sure the audience does as well. We did have one question that came through, and that was about the poem Bread. And the question was, is there any possibility that there was some reference there to the bread used at a Mass for Eucharist, for instance?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. Yes, actually, in another note that refers to bread, in another poem, she writes that, because she wrote a lot of notes on her, like footnotes in her poetry. And I think fundamentally because she was a teacher, and she says that those footnotes helped guide the reader and be with the reader. So she writes that pan also represents the face of God. And I totally agree with you. I actually started writing, in that section about pan, that we can think of the sacred and the mythic, right? And religious acts of, transubstantiation in the Catholic sense. But I didn't quite want to get through, I didn't want to engage that in this paper in particular, but you're completely right. Yes, I totally agree with you. And it was consistent with Mistral's work to consider, and that's what I mean by her interculturality, to consider these cosmogonies and religions in relation to one another, rather than one as superior to the other, or one using one lens to look at the other. So that's why I think it's important that she places, that she draws from many different traditions to think through her work.
Okay.
Did she actually practice a religion herself?
That's a great question. She did, and her work is actually held in Chile by the Franciscans. So yeah, she did practice a religion, and particularly after her mother's death, but even before, she really tried to connect and understand Andean religious cultures from her region, as well as religions from other regions of Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just make a comment or piggyback on something you were saying, Anna, that, that pan meaning bread in Spanish, but also kind of the sense of maybe Pan, the Greek god of the wild, patron of music as well. Do you think she was?
Oh, that's interesting. That hadn't occurred to me.
Just given that, she refers elsewhere to Ceres, so
Yes.
she clearly has an awareness of kind of Greco-Roman mythology as well. So maybe a bit of wordplay in there.
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering about, how much Christ child imagery is in these representations of children. And you read the poems and you feel a sense of, you can almost see the children. And partly that's because, of course, you had the visuals and the images with the presentation. But if you think about the child as a representative of the child in the poem as representing something more than that, and it might not be just one thing. I wondered if you had thought through that.
She definitely uses the Christ image throughout a lot of her oeuvre. And in fact, her first work, Desolación, which means desolation, it's very interesting because I believe it's the second or the third poem. So like the second poem, she ends with this concept of breastfeeding or bringing to one's breast a child that is not one's own. So there she has the idea of non-biological parenting. And then the next poem begins with a Christ figure and an image of the Christ figure's breast. So what I find, and I think this is part of the possibilities that Mistral sees in poetic form, that is the possibility of transferring from one poem to the next these concepts of maternity, so that are generally that are obviously associated with biological females, to an image like the Christ figure with a breast. So, and in another poem, in the section called America from Tala, the book we consider today, she actually uses the term lo madre. So lo as in a masculine, a masculine term, with madre, which obviously means mother. So she was constantly creating these combinations and never shying away from thinking of the Christ figure as also maternal.
It also, sorry, Kathryn, but it's also the Christ child, the babe, as being a refugee also.
Yes, also.
Yeah,
definitely.
And this has, as you were talking, I just been watching the news about the refugees and what's happening to the refugees in Britain at the moment. There's so contemporary with what is happening from Syria, what is happening with Ukraine, and so on at that present time.
and all over Latin America.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with you, and I figured we would move to that in our conversation, that this is what she most feared, and this is what we're seeing happening. So particularly the massive exile and displacement of our most precarious individuals who are children.
Yeah.
Well, and that
and
brings me to
in large part to global warming.
Right.
Or
so that actually brings me to one of the questions that has been posed, which is that there seems to be a deep sadness to the poetry, and how might that sadness square with this idea of poetry giving us joy and hope? Right.
That's a great question. She says, I didn't quote this passage, but she says in that section called Reasons for this book, she says that she hopes the book washes her of her misery. At the same time, at the center of Tala, as we culminate into the section of materials that culminates into America. So think of this beautiful sweeping considerations of bread, water, salt, and then air. And then it just opens to this sublime concept of America and these hymns and hymns to maize, for example. She says this beautiful line, which is "Tengo ganas de cantar." It's too formal to say I have the will to sing. I feel like singing. I feel like singing. And so I think that, first of all, the idea that poetic form or that singing is something of happiness in that sense of an alegría, as we would say in Spanish, is not necessarily what is happening here. We sing because of the need to do so. So we sing as a way, and we have alegría, we have these forms, these poetic forms or sound forms of happiness because of the suffering we experience. And that's different from the concept of happiness, that I'm talking about at the end of this essay, that has to do with the Gallup poll. I think that work in happiness that Raul Zurita is talking about, and that the Gallup poll is considering, has to do with meeting individuals' basic needs. And those needs are there largely because of displacement, exile, and global warming.
Well, and it does seem that if the basic needs aren't met, then there is no possibility of enjoying the kind of joy that you would get from singing, from poetry, from art, right? That it becomes very difficult to find that kind of happiness. So there's like two levels of happiness here, right? I see this even in our local community here, where basic needs are met, right? But there's kind of a struggle to keep meeting them, and people are not able to transcend, the dailiness of life, right? And enjoy this and sing, they are to a certain extent, but it's very limited.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm thinking with, just to distill what you're saying, I'm thinking about, for example, the need for children to eat if they're going to go to school and learn.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So something like that, right? And Mistral, in her notes on pedagogy, was very aware and attentive to those needs.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that's like a practical, material need of the child, so that the child can learn. At the same time, I think it's dangerous to think of an appreciation of cultural forms or of poetic forms or musical forms as something that can be experienced, engaged, or enjoyed only if the body's needs are met. And because I would suggest that we produce these forms precisely because of our suffering, as a response to our suffering.
Can I jump in there?
I'm saying that, see some examples of that. Yeah, good, Joe, go ahead.
I just thinking back to your beautiful imagery around music and point and counterpoint and sort of these close harmonies, and that it's compatible to have sort of material misery and some sort of a deep well of joy or power to overcome those things. So it's not altogether surprising that they might be overlapping or touching. And that's sort of what creates sort of a deeper beauty in the music, that point and counterpoint you were talking about. So I was very taken by the musical imagery you used, I thought, and how that kind of got woven into her poetry in a beautiful way. So.
Thank you. But I think what she's also trying to do is teach us how to listen. And what is most difficult to hear is a child who can't speak, who's hungry. Right. So I think she's teaching us how to listen, and she has these other sounds, particularly in the section again of materiales, in which she sounds like the sound of sitting on a dune. Do you know, so there's these very delicate sounds. It's not complete silence. It's a very delicate sound. Or just think of the sound of holding bread. There is a sound there. She's teaching us how to listen to it. At the same time that she's also pushing toward this devastating sense of absence.
I guess I'm developing or rejecting my own first thought here, but I was thinking while you're speaking about both singing as a way of compensating for not having enough or for losses, but also the way children, even when they're hungry and they're uncared for, they will play, right? And that poetry and playing with sound are also ways of playing. So.
Or do you know another way of thinking of it is that that when you nourish a child in that child's early stages, that nourishment is always through holding the child. Right? You don't just give nourishment to a child without holding the child. Both are necessary. So as much, you know, what is in the milk, the nutritional scientific value of the milk, in addition to the need to be held and to have that human touch and intersubjectivity that goes along with that nutriment. So, and I think that also responds to these ideas of hunger and loneliness.
And I guess
that both are necessary. And you know, we know that the only sense an individual cannot appropriately grow without is the sense of touch. We have to be touched and we have to be held. And that meets our need to avoid solitude and loneliness.
Well, you know, that's so interesting because poetry is just words on a page, right? But there's also a sense in the containment of the lines of a kind of holding action, and kind of just the fact that you're gathering your thoughts in such a sort of concrete form seems to imply that kind of holding. And
yes, I agree with you. I think she does that throughout her verse. She's constantly turning objects and looking at them from different perspectives. She's constantly rounding them. So it's me and you. You know, we look at each other, one toward the other. And so there's always this sense of closeness and intimacy to whatever she's considering.
And someone has asked a question that I actually had also wanted to ask, which is, what have you learned as a translator of poetry regarding the challenges of capturing sound and meter? It seems like a difficult craft, right? And I also thinking about like identity issues. Your own identity is merged, perhaps. I don't really know, Puerto Rican and a U.S. citizen as well, right? And well, they are, yeah. So two different places, two different origins. And I'm wondering about the translation. You know, translation also seems to be taking on someone else's identity and yet bringing it into Englishness. And I wondered if you could talk about that.
So I think to answer the first question, that the poetry itself teaches you how to translate it. So that Mistral, through her use of sound and meter, is teaching me how to translate her. So I'll look for very close sound relationships. For example, here. Also, she'll always fill a line in its syllabic count. So she'll repeat a word. Like for example, in that one line, de tu gozo y de mi gozo, right? She'll repeat a word to fill that line. So that structure is important to her. And so, whereas I don't know if you noticed in Ursula Le Guin's translations, she didn't so much, she does have a very beautiful rhythmic beauty to her work in Le Guin's translations, but she does not privilege that full line that in English would be, full of feet, right? And so, whereas I will, because I think it's a structure that she's working in tension with, and I think that gives meaning, deeper meaning to her work, to the ideas that she's managing. So to answer the viewer's question, the poetry itself teaches me how to translate it.
So
and
there's
it's through a
another
deep
question.
reading of that work that I make my decisions.
No, I think that really makes a lot of sense. And I guess there probably in translation theory, there's different positions on how free a translation can be, how close you stick to the original meter, et cetera. Right.
Yeah.
I was very interested in, why do you think Ursula Le Guin chose to translate this poem?
Well, she translated a selection of works, and I was speaking with Francine Maciello, my professor at Berkeley of poetry and of Latin American poetry, and she has suggested that Diana Bellesi, a contemporary Argentinian writer, helped Ursula Le Guin make this selection. And Le Guin herself was very interested in dialogues and collaborations through translation. So she did a book with Diana Bellesi called Answer Me, Dance My Dance, in which they have a book together and translate one another. And so then Ursula Le Guin also has this selected works of Gabriela Mistral.
Interesting.
Like Langston Hughes, who translated Mistral in the 1950s, because Mistral was the first Nobel Prize in literature in Latin America, and only the fifth woman who had ever won a Nobel Prize in literature, it's always surprising to see that she has not been widely translated. There are a handful of selected works of hers, but for example, all of Tala hasn't been translated, and that's what I'm doing. Desolación was translated a few years ago, and it's a good translation. But Lagar, Poema de Chile, the rest of her works have, in their entirety, have not been translated. So I believe that influenced Ursula Le Guin in her decision to translate Mistral.
One more question.
You would ask, would you like me to answer your other question, Kathryn?
Sure.
Oh, or do you want to go to this last question?
Well, I sort of feel like maybe we should go to the person who's asked this question. Thank you for introducing Mistral to us. Do any of her poems on maternity talk about loneliness? And I ask this because of the crucial need for accompaniment as the core of interconnectedness.
A crucial need for, what was that?
Accompaniment.
Oh, accompaniment. Okay, so that's a great question. Do you know, in that last poem, Dormida, and in also the poem Bread that I read, if you'll notice, there are no men. There's no paternal figure in the space.
The men are off selling the land.
Yeah, there's no paternal figure in the other room. There's no paternal figure, out somewhere, or that she's waiting to come back. So I think that you could interpret that, which is, I think, if I'm understanding correctly, you could interpret that as a sense of solitude or loneliness. I also read it as a different form of non-biological and biological parenting. I read it as a range of how we can parent children who aren't necessarily biologically ours, so that she doesn't require in the sense that we are responsible for all children. we as humans are responsible for children as a
Right,
group, right?
Yeah, I love that part of what you said towards the end about what it means to have humanity, right? To be the right kind of human. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting because she's not necessarily privileging this biological ideal mother-child relationship. She's not necessarily privileging it. I think what she is doing, which is back to your question, the viewer's question, is establishing it as a foundation of thinking of the human. So in the same way that we think of, fraternitas as a foundation of the French Revolution, brotherhood. Well, why is that privileged over maternitas, over motherhood, as a cornerstone of how we understand human relationships and as the model of human relationships? So I think that there's a real image that she's understanding in the relationship of adults with children. But then I think there's a metaphorical level there that this is the cornerstone of humanity. And also in a practical way, this is a relationship that needs to be protected if we want to safeguard the future of our regions. And that's true.
Yeah, and thank you so much for this. I feel like we could have a much longer conversation about it. So
thank
perhaps
you.
we'll
Thank
be
you so much.
able to have you back at some point later in the series. I'm going to turn it back over to Joe to close us out, since I think Michael has lost his connection.
Thank you, Kathryn, and thank you, Anna, so much for introducing us to Gabriela Mistral. I find her just a fascinating poet, and I want to dig in both in the Spanish and the English. For those of us who are familiar, for those of you joining us regularly, our next event in the series Literature, Art, and the Environment is John Ruskin's Torcello, brought to us by John Fordresher. So we look forward to hearing about him next Tuesday. That'll be at 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time and 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And at that point, our schedules will be back online with the change of times. There's also a free speech talk on the 14th of November, Life After Putin, Russia and the West. So please look out for emails from that, about that from the Global Engagement. And also, as you probably already know, we're having our live conference and symposium in Oxford that Kathryn will be presenting at. I'll be there, and Michael Scott and several others from Georgetown in conjunction with Campion Hall and Blackfriars on the Christian literary imagination. And you can find details about that on Georgetown's website, where you find details about this as well. So we thank all of those people at Blackfriars and Campion Hall